Let's test the cheap versus expensive shop vac. And cheap just edged out the win again. Very cool. Let's try cheap versus expensive pipe cutters. Cheap cuts well but takes some effort. And now for expensive, it's very quickly. Expensive wins because it's quicker. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive hand wipes. Cheap did a brilliant job. Now expensive, impressive immediately. Expensive won because it's quicker. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive shop vacs.
Expensive is the winner this time. Very cool.
Let's test cheap versus expensive impact driver. And expensive wins. Very cool. Let's try cheap versus expensive paint.
Expensive wins. Very cool.
Let's try cheap versus expensive mini rollers.
Expensive is the winner. Very cool.
Let's test cheap versus expensive shop vacs. And it's a draw. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive impact drivers. And expensive edged out the win. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive blenders. And expensive took the win. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive fluffy rollers. And expensive won. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive sanders. And cheap won. Very cool. Let's test cheap versus expensive chisels. And cheap won. Very cool. Let's try cheap versus expensive electric sprayer. And cheap won. Very cool.